The Silent Cry by Marlowe Graves. Chapter 1. The Echo in the Dark. The town of Blackwood was the kind of place where secrets clung to the walls of old houses, where the streets whispered stories that no one dared to tell. Tucked away from the rest of the world, it was the kind of town where nothing ever happened until the night the screaming began. It started with a sound that sliced through the silence like a blade. A scream, high, sharp, and full of terror, echoed through the mist-laden streets, waking the town from its slumber. No one knew where it had come from. No one knew who had screamed. And when the townspeople emerged from their homes, lanterns and flashlights in hand, they found nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No body. Just the silence that followed. Detective Caleb Mercer sat at his desk in the Blackwood Police Department, staring at the open case file in front of him. It was the third time this month. 3 separate nights, 3 identical screams, and still no answers. The reports were all the same. Residents heard the scream, but no one could pinpoint the source. Every witness described it differently. Some swore it came from the forest at the town's edge. Others said it echoed from the abandoned train station. A few even claimed it had come from right outside their own homes. But when they checked, nothing. Caleb ran a hand over his face. He had been a detective for over a decade, had seen more than his fair share of strange cases, but this one unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. There was something wrong about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Still nothing? The voice belonged to Officer Sarah Whitmore, his partner in what now felt like an investigation going nowhere. She leaned against the doorway, her expression tight with unease. Nothing, Caleb admitted. No reports of missing people. No evidence. Just the scream. Sarah exhaled slowly. It's not just a scream, Caleb. People are afraid. I was at the coffee shop this morning. Everyone's talking about it. Some think it's a ghost. Some think it's a warning. Caleb let out a dry chuckle. A warning for what? Sarah hesitated. I don't know, but it feels like we're missing something. Something big. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young officer, barely out of the academy, stood at the threshold, his face pale. You need to come to the church, he said. Now, Blackwood's church sat on a small hill overlooking the town, its towering steeple casting long shadows against the mist. By the time Caleb and Sarah arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside, murmuring in hushed voices. What happened? Caleb asked as he stepped out of the car. The young officer led them inside without a word. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and candle wax. But there was something else, too, something metallic, something wrong. Then Caleb saw it. Near the altar, sprawled on the stone floor, lay a man. His face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, his mouth wide open in a silent scream. There were no visible wounds, no signs of struggle, but his eyes were wide, unblinking, and lifeless. Sarah knelt beside the body, pressing 2 fingers to his throat. After a moment, she shook her head. He's gone. Caleb's stomach twisted. Who is he? Father Mathis, one of the townspeople answered, his voice shaking. He was the priest here for nearly 20 years. Caleb looked around the church, scanning the shadows. Who found him? I did. A woman stepped forward, an elderly nun, her wrinkled face pale beneath her veil. I came early to prepare for morning prayer, and her voice trembled. I heard the scream. Caleb and Sarah exchanged glances. The same scream? Sarah asked carefully. The nun nodded. It was coming from inside the church. A chill crept down Caleb's spine. This time, there was no doubt. The scream wasn't just a rumor, wasn't just fear feeding itself. It was real, and now someone was dead. As the morning light seeped through the stained glass windows, casting eerie patterns over the lifeless body of Father Mathis, Caleb knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in Blackwood had only just begun. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Dark. The autopsy report offered no answers. Father Mathis had no visible wounds, no signs of trauma. His heart had simply stopped. It was as if fear itself had killed him. The coroner ruled it as cardiac arrest, but Detective Caleb Mercer wasn't convinced. There was something unnatural about the way the priest's body had been found. His mouth frozen in an eternal scream, silent but terrifying. He sat in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp barely cutting through the darkness. The case file lay open before him, but the pages held nothing but dead ends. The same scream, the same eerie, unexplained phenomenon. And now, their first death. Onto his desk. I looked into Father Mathis's background. Nothing unusual. Served here for 2 decades, well-liked, no enemies. But get this, she tapped the folder. He filed a complaint with the diocese 2 weeks ago. He claimed the church was haunted. Caleb frowned. Haunted? Sarah nodded. He reported hearing whispers, voices when he was alone, doors opening and closing by themselves, objects moving. He said he felt a presence. Did the church take him seriously? They dismissed it, said he was overworked. Caleb exhaled, staring at the photo of the lifeless priest. If Mathis had been right, if something unnatural had been inside the church, then they were dealing with something far worse than they'd imagined. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. It was Deputy Mark Evans, his face pale. You both need to come outside. Now. The streets of Blackwood were usually empty at this hour, but tonight the town square was alive with murmurs and frightened whispers. A small crowd had gathered near the old clock tower, eyes fixed on something just beyond the trees. Caleb and Sarah pushed through the people until they reached the front of the crowd. And then they saw it. Edge of the woods, illuminated by the flickering glow of a street lamp. Her clothes were torn, her hair wild and tangled, and her face was twisted in a look of pure, unfiltered terror. She didn't move, didn't blink. And then she screamed. The sound was inhuman, piercing through the night like shattered glass. It wasn't just a scream, it was the scream. The same one heard for weeks, the same one that had haunted the town. But this time, it wasn't coming from nowhere. It was coming from her. Caleb and Sarah rushed forward. Ma'am, can you hear me? Sarah asked, gently reaching for the woman's arm. The woman flinched violently, her body jerking as if she had been struck. Then her eyes darted toward them, wide and unseeing. Her lips trembled, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He's coming. Caleb felt a chill crawl up his spine. Who's coming? The woman shuddered, hugging herself. The one who screams. The one who watches. Sarah exchanged a look with Caleb. What's your name? The woman blinked, as if the question confused her. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, Emily Carter. Caught in his throat. Emily Carter had been missing for 2 months. Back at the station, Emily sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the floor. She had been given water, but she hadn't touched it. Her hands trembled slightly, and every now and then she would flinch at sounds no one else seemed to hear. Caleb sat across from her, his voice low and careful. Emily, can you tell us what happened? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I was taken. Sarah leaned forward. By who? Emily's eyes darted toward the shadows in the corner of the room, as if something unseen lingered there. I don't know, she whispered. I don't remember where I was. Just darkness. And the voice. His voice. Caleb's pulse quickened. The one who screams? Emily nodded, gripping the blanket tighter. He whispers first. You hear him when you're alone. In the dark. At first it's just a sound, like breathing, just behind you. Then it becomes a whisper, a name. Sarah swallowed. What name? Emily's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head violently. I can't say it. If I say it, he'll know. A silence fell over the room. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass. Caleb leaned forward. Emily, how did you escape? Emily shivered. I didn't. Caleb and Sarah exchanged glances. Emily's voice was almost a breath now. He let me go. A long silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time since she had arrived, Emily lifted her eyes to Caleb's, and what he saw there sent a chill down his spine. Fear. Not just fear, pure mind-breaking terror. He let me go, she whispered, because he wants you to find him. Outside, in the darkness beyond the streetlights, the wind carried a sound, a faint, distant scream. And this time it was closer. Chapter 3, The Scream That Lingers. The next morning, Blackwood felt different. The usual quiet, almost sleepy atmosphere had been replaced with a tense, suffocating silence. People whispered behind closed doors, eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. No one spoke much, and when they did, it was in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly would awaken something they weren't ready to face. Caleb sat at his desk, staring at the report in front of him. Emily Carter's disappearance had been a cold case, one that hadn't been touched for weeks. Now the mystery of her return was tangled in a web far darker than they could have anticipated. He flipped through the case file on his desk, his eyes catching on a particular note, something he had missed in the chaos of the previous days. A name that had been connected to multiple unsolved disappearances over the years. Charles Rayner. The name meant nothing to Caleb at first. But then he remembered. A few years ago, Rayner had been the prime suspect in a string of disappearances that had terrorized neighboring towns. The case had gone cold, and Rayner had disappeared without a trace. But now, as Caleb reread the case file, he felt a slow, creeping realization. Rayner's disappearance was too perfect. The man had slipped off the grid entirely, but there had never been any evidence of his death. No body, no closure. Caleb stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned toward the door, his mind already racing ahead. He had to find Rayner. It was the only lead that made any sense. Sarah was waiting for him in the parking lot when he arrived, her face pale. She handed him a small, weathered journal. I found this at Emily's house, she said, her voice tight. She was writing in it. I think it's important. Caleb took the journal, his fingers brushing the worn leather cover. It looked old, old enough to hold secrets that had been buried for years. He flipped it open, scanning the first page. The handwriting was shaky, the words almost illegible, but Caleb could make out a few phrases. I hear him in the dark. He watches when I sleep. He knows my name. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine as he read. The words were a rambling mess, a stream of fractured thoughts, but they all pointed to one thing. Emily had been hearing it, the same presence that had haunted Father Mathis. The same one that had driven her to the edge of madness. He flipped through more pages, his eyes scanning rapidly. Then he froze. On the final page, there was a single sentence. It was written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. He wants me to bring you to him. Caleb's stomach churned. It was a message meant for him. He could feel it in his bones. Whoever or whatever was behind these events wanted him involved. And Emily, like Father Mathis before her, was just another piece in the puzzle. This is just getting worse, Sarah murmured from behind him. Caleb closed the journal with a snap, the finality of it sinking into his chest. We need to find Raynor. Now. They didn't waste any time. Caleb and Sarah drove to the outskirts of Blackwood, to a rundown farmhouse that had been abandoned for years. According to the reports, Charles Raynor had lived there before he disappeared. The house had been left untouched, a silent monument to the case that had never been solved. As they approached, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees like a distant scream. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by something that didn't want them here. The farmhouse was a decaying shell, its windows boarded up, the roof sagging. Caleb pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets that no one had ever dared to hear. They moved cautiously through the house, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the layers of grime on the floor. As they made their way to the back room, Caleb's flashlight flickered, then died. Great, Sarah muttered, her voice tinged with frustration. Caleb cursed under his breath and swapped the batteries, but even as he did, he felt it, a chill that hadn't been there before. The air seemed heavier now, as though something was pressing down on them. Then they heard it. A faint sound at first, barely audible over the wind. A soft, dragging noise, like something or someone moving in the next room. Caleb's hand went to his gun, but before he could speak, Sarah's voice cut through the tension. Did you hear that? It was a whisper, too soft to make out. But it was there. Caleb could feel it. Something or someone was in the house with them. They moved toward the source of the sound, hearts pounding in their chests. The room was dark, but the faint outline of something or someone was visible in the corner. And then, as if in response to their presence, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. A man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his clothes were tattered and worn. It was Charles Raynor. Caleb froze, his breath catching in his throat. You're alive? Raynor's lips curled into a twisted smile. Alive? Hardly. And then, before Caleb could react, the air around them seemed to vibrate with a sound, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was the scream. The same scream. The one that had haunted Blackwood. The one that had killed Father Mathis. And it was coming from him. Chapter 4, Echoes in the Dark. The scream hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Caleb's heart raced as the sound reverberated through the walls, deep and guttural, the kind that seemed to crawl beneath your skin and take root in your soul. Charles Raynor stood before them, his eyes hollow, his form barely tethered to the mortal world. He was no longer a man, not in any sense Caleb could recognize. He was something else, something twisted and broken. Raynor, Caleb shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos of sound. What's happening here? Why are you doing this? Raynor tilted his head, as though contemplating the question, before giving a slow, mocking laugh. Doing this? You think I'm the one doing this? His voice was raspy, a faint echo of something that had once been human. I'm not the one pulling the strings. Caleb felt his pulse quicken. The scream intensified, clawing its way through the house as if the very walls themselves were alive and crying out in agony. It was so loud now that his ears rang, his head pounding with the pressure of it. Who is? Sarah demanded, her hand shaking as she clutched her flashlight. Raynar's lips curled into a grim smile. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. The light flickered again, casting strange, distorted shadows against the walls. Caleb could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on them, threatening to smother any shred of hope. It felt as if the house itself was a living thing, its breath thick with despair. Tell me, Caleb insisted, stepping forward. You're the only lead we have left. Raynor's eyes glinted, a cold, distant amusement in them. You think I know more than I do? You think I'm the answer? He laughed again, the sound bitter and hollow. I'm just a pawn detective. You're chasing ghosts. The scream you're hearing, it's not mine. It's not even human. The air grew colder, as if Raynor's words had sucked the warmth from the room. Caleb's breath came out in short, sharp bursts. He glanced at Sarah, who was clearly just as unnerved. Then what is it? Sarah's voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground. Raynor's smile faltered. His expression darkened, and for a moment he seemed like the man he once was. It's echo. An echo was something that was never meant to be heard. A voice, too loud, too powerful, trapped in this world by forces you can't understand. Caleb frowned, stepping closer. What do you mean? Who is it? Who's doing this? Raynor looked away, his face twisting with a mix of fear and sorrow. You don't get it, do you? You think you can stop it, but you can't. No one can. Before Caleb could speak, Raynor's body convulsed, his face contorting in pain. The scream reached a fever pitch, and Caleb's mind spun, a dizzying sensation taking hold of him as the world around him seemed to tilt. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Raynor spoke again. It's in the town. It's always been here, waiting. The scream is just the beginning. With that, Raynor's body fell to the floor with a sickening thud. Caleb rushed forward, kneeling beside him, but it was clear that the man was no longer alive. There was nothing but an empty shell left. Sarah stepped back, her face pale as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The air was thick with unease, the scream now nothing more than a distant murmur, as though the very essence of Blackwood was somehow retreating. Caleb stood up, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just a case of one disturbed man causing havoc. Whatever had happened to Raynor, whatever he had become, it was part of something much larger, something insidious and deeply rooted in the town's history. What did he mean by it's in the town? Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Caleb turned to her, his expression grim. I don't know, but I intend to find out. The journey back to Blackwood was silent. The air in the car felt heavy, like they were driving through a fog that wouldn't lift. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the town was changing, that something was waking up beneath its surface. The unsettling feeling that had been growing in him for days now felt like a solid weight pressing on his chest. As they entered the town, Caleb noticed how eerily quiet everything seemed. The streets were empty, the usual bustle of life absent. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for the inevitable. We need to talk to the locals, Caleb said, breaking the silence. Someone here has to know something. Raynor wasn't just some random man. There's something bigger at play. Sarah nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. She had seen too much in such a short span of time. The murders, the disappearances, Raynor's twisted warning. It was all too much to process. Where do we start? She asked. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he drove past the town's small square, where the town hall loomed ominously in the distance. We start at the beginning. The scream. Someone has to know about it. We need to find out who. The car's headlights flickered, then went out entirely. Caleb cursed under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. He glanced at Sarah, who was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eyes wide with sudden alarm. Stay here, Caleb ordered. I'll check the engine. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting nervously to the dark streets around them. But Caleb was already out of the car, moving toward the front hood. The moment his foot hit the pavement, he felt it again, that presence. A weight in the air. He paused, feeling the chill creep up his spine. The darkness seemed to stretch unnaturally around him, thickening as if it were alive. Something was watching them. Caleb forced himself to focus on the car, ignoring the rising panic in his chest. He reached for the hood, but as his hand touched the metal, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. Slow, methodical. He whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the silence. And then the scream. The same piercing, anguished cry that had haunted him since the moment this case began. It echoed through the night, closer than ever. But no one was there. Chapter 5. The Silent Watchers. The scream was all-encompassing, a jagged shard of sound that tore through the night, ripping away the stillness of the town. Caleb's skin prickled as the noise seemed to crawl beneath his bones, rattling his every thought. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he turned frantically, searching for its source. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice strained, but the only answer was the echo of the scream, bouncing off the silent, empty streets. He rushed back to the car, his footsteps heavy against the asphalt. Sarah's door was open, but she was nowhere to be seen. The seat where she had been sitting was empty, her flashlight discarded on the ground, flickering weakly in the cool night air. His heart sank. No, not again. Not her too. Caleb's eyes darted around, scanning the shadows that clung to the edges of the street. He felt the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in on him, as if it were alive, alive and watching. He knew deep down that Sarah hadn't just wandered off. Something had taken her, and it was the same something that had been leaving its mark on Blackwood for decades. A rustling noise came from the alley to his right, faint but unmistakable. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to his gun, but he hesitated. The scream had rattled him, shaken his confidence in the cold rationality he usually relied on. There was no way this was a simple kidnapping, no matter how it looked. Steeling himself, Caleb moved toward the alley. He barely registered the sound of his own breathing, the sharp rasp in his throat as he peered into the darkness. His flashlight beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but a shiver of movement in the distance. Another rustle. Caleb's muscles tensed, and he stepped forward, carefully placing one foot in front of the other. The hairs on the back of his neck rose, as if some primal part of him was telling him to turn around, to run. But he couldn't. Not now. He reached the mouth of the alley and froze. A figure stood there, cloaked in darkness, their back to him. The figure was tall, unnaturally still, and seemed to absorb the light around them. Caleb could just make out the faint outline of a hooded figure, one that had not been there a second ago. He called out, "Sarah?" The figure didn't move. Another step forward. His heart pounded in his chest. but his instincts screamed at him to stay sharp. The figure turned slowly, a deliberate motion that sent a chill running down Caleb's spine. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't Sarah. The figure's face was hidden beneath a dark hood, but Caleb could see the gleam of eyes staring back at him. Too wide, too intense. The air itself seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. And then, just as the scream had done earlier, the figure's voice sliced through the silence. The end is coming, detective. The town cannot escape what it is, nor what it has become. Caleb's chest tightened, his thoughts scrambling to make sense of the cryptic words. He reached for his gun, but before he could pull it free from its holster, the figure raised a hand in warning. You can't stop it. It's already begun. Caleb took another step forward, his voice low and commanding. Who are you? The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, one that didn't reach their eyes. Who am I? They repeated, as if savoring the question. I'm the Watcher. I have always been the Watcher. And I will be here when it's over. Without another word, the figure turned and melted into the shadows of the alley, vanishing as if they had never been there. Caleb rushed forward, his heart hammering in his chest, but the alley was empty. Nothing. He stood there, bewildered and shaken, the scream still reverberating in his mind. The figure's words echoed in his ears, a whisper that seemed to claw at his sanity. The end is coming. The town cannot escape. Caleb's head spun, but he forced himself to focus. He had to find Sarah. Whatever that figure was, whatever game it was playing, it had just made it clear. Time was running out, and the town was on the brink of something far worse than they had imagined. The streets of Blackwood seemed eerily deserted as Caleb moved through them, his footsteps echoing louder in the silence than they should. The once bustling town had been reduced to a ghostly shell of itself, as if the very life had been sucked out. Caleb's stomach twisted in unease, but he pushed forward. He wasn't going to stop until he had answers, until he found Sarah. His mind kept circling back to the figure in the alley. Who or what was it? And why had it spoken to him like that? A sudden movement caught his eye, a flash of white in the distance. Caleb's breath caught. There, on the edge of the town square, he saw her. Sarah. She was standing motionless, staring straight ahead, her face blank and unseeing. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he hurried toward her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. Sarah. Still nothing. When he reached her, he gently shook her shoulder, trying to pull her from the trance she seemed to be in. She blinked slowly, her eyes clouded, as if she was just waking from a deep sleep. Caleb? Her voice was faint, as if she wasn't quite sure where she was. What happened? Are you all right? Caleb asked, worry creeping into his voice. She nodded slowly, though her expression remained distant. I don't know. I was just walking, and then she trailed off, her brow furrowing as she tried to remember. Then it hit her. The scream, she whispered, her voice trembling. It, it was all around me. It was like something was pulling me in. Caleb's mind raced. Could the scream have affected her somehow? Had it done something to her mind? Let's get you out of here, he said, guiding her gently toward the car. But as they walked back toward the square, Caleb noticed something strange. People were starting to appear, shadows moving in the distance, figures emerging from the darkness. They weren't walking. They were standing, watching. Dozens of them, all facing him. And then they began to move. Chapter 6. The Gathering Shadows. The hairs on the back of Caleb's neck stood on end as he led Sarah toward the car, his eyes darting between the figures that had begun to materialize in the darkness. They were everywhere. At first, it was just a few standing motionless at the edge of the street, but now the numbers were growing, emerging from the shadows like silent wraiths, their eyes all trained on Caleb and Sarah. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, filled with a mix of fear and confusion. She clung to Caleb's arm, her steps growing more frantic as the figures began to close in. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't have an answer, but he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Not now. Not when they were so close to discovering the truth. "We need to get to the car. Now," he said, his tone sharp, desperate. But no sooner had they taken a few more steps than a sound sliced through the air. A low, drawn-out whisper, like wind moving through 1,000 voices. "Leave or join us." The words were soft, eerie, and distant, but Caleb felt their weight bearing down on him. He turned his head, trying to locate the source of the whisper, but the figures around him remained silent, their expressions unreadable. The whisper came again, only this time it was louder, more insistent. "Leave or join us." Caleb's stomach twisted as he turned back to Sarah, his grip tightening on her arm. "We're leaving. Now." They rushed toward the car, but the figures moved with them, their pace unnervingly synchronized. Caleb's pulse quickened, his mind racing. Why weren't they speaking? Why weren't they running? As they neared the car, Caleb heard something that froze his blood. A scream. It wasn't the same as before. This one was much closer. A piercing cry of agony that seemed to reverberate through the very air around them. Caleb whipped his head around, trying to find the source, but it was impossible to pinpoint. The cry echoed and fractured, splitting into 1,000 different directions, all of them blending into one cacophony of pain. Sarah clung to Caleb, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Where is it coming from?" she gasped. Caleb didn't answer. His gaze was locked on the growing crowd of figures surrounding them. They were closer now, too close, too many of them. And they weren't moving, they were watching, waiting. Another whisper. "Join us, Caleb." This time, it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, an undeniable pull, an ancient and malevolent force that tugged at his very soul. The voice seemed to reach into his chest, scraping at his heart, and Caleb felt his resolve begin to crack. "No," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I won't join you." But as he spoke, the figures took a step forward, and the air grew colder. The streetlights flickered, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to crawl along the pavement like living things. Caleb felt a shiver run down his spine, but he refused to let fear take hold. He had no choice. He couldn't afford to fall prey to whatever this was. He shoved Sarah into the car and slammed the door behind her, his heart hammering as he scrambled into the driver's seat. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but the figures were already gone, vanishing into the night like ghosts fading with the dawn. "Caleb," Sarah's voice trembled. "What was that? Who were they?" Caleb gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I don't know, but we're getting out of here. We can't stay." As he started the car and sped down the street, he cast one last look in the rearview mirror. The figures were still there, but they were no longer standing still. They were following them. Not on foot, but in the reflection, shadowed forms, moving in perfect synchronization, keeping pace with the car as if they were riding along with them. "They're not real," Sarah whispered, as if trying to convince herself. But Caleb knew better. No, these weren't just shadows. These were something much darker, something that had been waiting, biding its time until it was ready to claim Blackwood as its own. And now it seemed it was calling them to join. As the car tore down the empty streets, the air inside grew thick with the weight of unspoken terror. Caleb's eyes never left the road ahead, but he could feel the weight of the eyes in the rearview mirror, those cold, unblinking eyes. They were watching, waiting for something. "We need to get to the station," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "We need to find answers." Sarah nodded, though her face was drawn tight with fear. "But what if they're waiting for us there?" "We don't have a choice," Caleb said, his mind already calculating the quickest route to the station. "We need to find out what's going on before it's too late." The further they drove, the quieter the town became. There was no sound, no sign of life, just the eerie silence that wrapped around them, thick and suffocating. Caleb felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The shadows that had followed them in the rearview mirror were gone, but he didn't feel any safer. The night felt too heavy, too full of unseen things. Then, just as they neared the outskirts of Blackwood, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Caleb slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The figure stood motionless in front of them, blocking the way, its face still hidden beneath the hood. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the silhouette, unable to move. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. "Get out of the car," came the voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Caleb's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was the same voice he had heard in the alley earlier, the same voice that had warned him that the end was coming. "No," Caleb whispered, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. But the figure stepped forward, and the world around him seemed to shift. And then the car's engine sputtered and died. The darkness swallowed them whole. Chapter 7: The Unseen Hand. The silence in the car was oppressive. Caleb's fingers trembled on the steering wheel, his gaze locked on the figure standing just beyond the headlights, its form shrouded in shadow. The engine had sputtered to a halt without warning, the night air thick with the weight of something unnatural. He tried to restart the car, but the engine refused to turn over, leaving them stranded in the middle of the road with nowhere to go. "Caleb, what's happening?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, the terror in her eyes reflected back at him. She pressed herself back against the seat, clutching her arms tightly to her chest. "I don't know," Caleb said, his throat tight. "This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." The figure ahead didn't move, but the air around it seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, pressing in from all sides. Caleb's mind raced, his thoughts frantically trying to piece together the fragments of what they had witnessed, the murders, the strange figures, the whispers. But every thought led him back to one chilling conclusion. This wasn't just some coincidence. Something was pulling the strings, something far older, far darker than they could comprehend. He glanced at Sarah, but she was already staring out the window, her face pale, her breath shallow. The town of Blackwood had never felt so suffocating. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a low, haunting whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping itself around them like a chain. "Come to me." The voice was soft, like the wind brushing through dry leaves, yet it carried a terrible weight. Caleb's skin crawled at the sound, and instinctively he reached for the door handle, wanting to escape, to run. But the figure was still there, standing in the middle of the road, its presence like a barrier. "Don't," Sarah's voice trembled. "Please, don't get out." Caleb hesitated, his hand hovering over the door. The whispering grew louder. The words now garbled and indecipherable, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, all trying to push their way into his mind. "Caleb," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I don't want to die. I don't want this." He could feel her fear seeping into him, tightening around his chest. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be fine. But how could he? He didn't have any answers. He didn't even understand what was happening. The figure in front of them finally moved. Slowly, methodically, it took a step toward the car, its form shifting, almost like a shadow bleeding into the night. It reached out its hand, fingers long and slender, its motion fluid and unnatural. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to drive away, to break free from whatever this thing was. But his body refused to obey, frozen in place by an unseen force. Then the figure spoke again, this time in a voice so cold, so void of humanity, that Caleb's blood turned to ice. "You have been chosen." The words echoed in the car, reverberating through the metal and glass like the toll of a distant bell. Caleb's stomach twisted, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to shout at the figure to leave them alone, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure's hand slowly reached for the passenger side window, pressing against the glass with a soft tap. As it did, a chill swept over the car, and Caleb's breath came out in a visible puff. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that it felt as if winter had arrived overnight. Chosen for what? Caleb finally managed to croak, his voice hoarse, strained with fear. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if contemplating the question. Then it spoke again, its voice slower this time, deliberate. Chosen to join the others. At the mention of the others, Caleb's blood ran cold. The idea of being a part of something, anything, was terrifying enough. But the thought of joining the others, whoever they were, sent a ripple of horror through him. His mind flashed back to the figures in the alley, the ones that had followed them before. Were they like this thing? Were they all part of the same twisted game? Before Caleb could process the words, the figure raised its hand, and the night seemed to grow even darker. Shadows stretched and writhed across the ground, twisting in unnatural shapes. The air itself felt thick, as though something was suffocating it, choking it into stillness. And then, as if on cue, the figure stepped back, vanishing into the darkness. The road in front of them was empty once more. Caleb stared at the spot where the figure had been, disbelief written all over his face. He tried the ignition again, and this time the engine roared to life, shuddering as if it had been awakened from a long slumber. "Go! Go!" Sarah cried, her voice filled with urgency. Without a second thought, Caleb slammed the accelerator down, the tires screeching as the car shot forward. The darkness pressed in on them from all sides, but Caleb dared not look back. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been waiting for them in the night was still there, still watching, biding its time. They raced through the streets of Blackwood, passing by the empty homes and silent buildings, the streetlights flickering as if they were struggling to hold on to the last remnants of light. The town was deathly still, like a place forgotten by time itself. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "What do we do now?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. He didn't know where they could go, or what they could do to escape the pull of whatever had taken hold of Blackwood. But there was one place left, the place where it all began, the old church on the outskirts of town. It was a place full of history, of secrets buried deep within its walls. Maybe, just maybe, it held the key to ending this nightmare. "We're going to the church," Caleb said finally, his voice low but steady. "We have to find out what's happening. If there's any way to stop this, we need to start there." Sarah nodded, her face pale but resolute. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She knew that this was their only chance. As the car sped toward the church, the air inside grew heavy, thick with dread. Caleb's mind raced, but every thought seemed to pull him deeper into the darkness. The church loomed ahead, its silhouette casting a long shadow across the ground. Its tall spires reached up into the night sky, like fingers stretching towards some unseen force. But as they approached the gates, Caleb's heart sank. The church doors were wide open, as if inviting them in. And just beyond the threshold, in the dim light, Caleb thought he saw something moving. He slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, and they both stared at the open doors, their breath catching in their throats. Something was waiting inside. Chapter 8: The Hollow Echoes. The car stood still in front of the church, its headlights casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked stone steps that led up to the wide, arched doors. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, as if the building itself was slowly surrendering to the inevitable grip of time. For a moment, neither Caleb nor Sarah moved, the stillness surrounding them more suffocating than the darkness that pressed against the car windows. Caleb's hands were tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white, his eyes locked on the open doors of the church. The place seemed to beckon them in, an eerie invitation that neither of them could refuse, no matter how much they wanted to. Inside, the faintest stir of movement caught Caleb's attention, a shadow darting across the darkened doorway, just beyond the reach of the light. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Caleb nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, I saw it too." The figure that had appeared at the doorway was no longer visible, but the feeling of being watched lingered. It was as if the church itself had eyes, eyes that could see through the darkness, through the fear that clung to their bodies. The weight of it pressed on Caleb's chest, suffocating him with the sense that something ancient, something malevolent, was waiting just beyond the doors. "What are we doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice tight, but a flicker of determination breaking through. She was trying to hold it together, but Caleb could see the fear still dancing in her eyes, threatening to overtake her resolve. "We need to find out what's happening here," Caleb said, his voice low and steady, though doubt gnawed at him. "Whatever's been hunting us, whatever's behind these murders, it's tied to this place. We're going in, Sarah. It's the only way." She nodded, though it was clear that she was holding on to her courage by a thread. The grip on her seat tightened, her knuckles pale. Caleb threw open the car door, the harsh sound breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over them. His breath came out in a puff of visible vapor, the temperature having dropped even further. As he stepped out, the chill of the night wrapped around him like a shroud. He glanced back at Sarah, who had stayed behind for just a moment longer, her gaze lingering on the church before she too opened the door and followed him. Together they walked toward the steps of the church, the silence broken only by the echo of their footsteps against the cold stone. As they reached the top of the stairs, Caleb's hand hovered over the massive iron doors, a feeling of dread clawing at his chest. The doors creaked open with a sound like the groan of a dying man. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the faintest light filtering through the tall stained glass windows, casting warped, fractured colors across the floor. The interior of the church was massive, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into the dark unknown above. The scent of old wood and incense lingered, mixed with the faint metallic taste of something far darker. There was no sound, no flicker of life, just the quiet hum of the dark. "Caleb, this place feels wrong," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped inside, her hand brushing against the cold stone wall. She shuddered. "I know," he replied softly, "but we have to keep going." The air was heavier here, pressing in on them, making every breath feel like it was fought for. They moved slowly through the pews, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. Each step seemed to amplify the silence, making it feel even more oppressive, as if the church was swallowing them whole. The windows above, depicting scenes of saints and angels, appeared to distort in the dim light, their faces twisted in agony, as though they were screaming for help, help that would never come. At the altar, a single candle burned, its flame flickering wildly despite the lack of wind. But it wasn't the candle that caught their attention. It was the figure standing beside it. A tall, hooded man. His back was turned to them, and his hands were folded in front of him as if in prayer. The long, tattered cloak he wore swept across the ground, almost as if it were alive, dragging behind him like a shadow that refused to let go. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and Caleb instinctively stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who are you?" Caleb called out, his voice breaking the silence like a knife through soft flesh. The figure turned slowly, as if deliberately dragging out the moment. The hooded cloak cast his face in shadow, but there was a faint glow to his eyes, pale, almost glowing in the dim light. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. He had seen those eyes before, in his nightmares, in the alleyways. The same eyes that had stared at him from the darkness. "You are the ones," the man said, his voice soft, reverberating with an eerie calmness. "The ones who have wandered too far into this place. The ones who have heard the silent cry." Caleb took a step back, his hand reaching for Sarah's arm, pulling her closer. He could feel the coldness radiating off the man, a cold that wasn't of this world. His mind raced for answers, for anything that could explain the nightmare they had walked into, but no words came. "Why are we here?" Caleb demanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "What do you want from us?" The figure's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What I want is nothing. What you seek is everything." With a swift movement, he raised his hand, and the candlelight flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. Caleb's eyes snapped to the altar, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, he saw the image of a woman standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vision vanished. Sarah gasped, her hand clenching Caleb's arm. What was that? Who was she? But the figure before them only smiled again, a slow, deliberate motion. "She is a reminder," he said cryptically, "a reminder of what happens when you disturb the past." The air grew colder still, as if the very bones of the church were breathing against them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as though something deep below was awakening. Caleb's thoughts raced, the weight of the man's words settling over him like an inescapable fog. "Who is she? What's going on here?" Caleb demanded again, his voice rising in frustration. The figure raised a single finger to his lips, silencing him with a simple gesture. "The answers you seek are buried here. But beware," he added, his voice lowering to a whisper that seemed to come from all around them. "The truth is not for the faint of heart." With a sudden movement, the figure turned, his cloak swirling around him as he moved toward a darkened doorway at the far end of the church. "Follow if you dare," he called over his shoulder. "But know this, once you cross this threshold, there is no turning back." The door creaked open, revealing only inky blackness beyond. Caleb hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no turning back now. Whatever truth lay ahead, whatever nightmare awaited them, they had no choice but to follow. He took a deep breath, then, with Sarah close behind him, stepped into the unknown. Chapter 9. The Abyss Beckons. The darkness beyond the doorway was complete, a blackness so deep it seemed to absorb the very light of their souls. Caleb's heart pounded as he stepped into the void, each movement swallowed by the impenetrable shadows. The air was thick here, thicker than the church, thicker than the grave. It clung to their skin like a damp cloth, oppressive and suffocating, and for a moment Caleb wondered if they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Sarah's hand was tight in his, her grip a silent tether to the world of light and warmth they had left behind. But even that seemed to fade as they moved deeper into the darkness, their footsteps echoing against what seemed to be stone, but it was impossible to tell for sure. The walls around them felt as though they were alive, breathing, watching them move with a sense of purpose, as if waiting for something. Caleb, I don't like this. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, the sound cracking with fear. Keep going. We're almost there, Caleb muttered, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the mouth of a beast that'd been waiting for them. The strange figure they had encountered, the man with the glowing eyes, was gone, but his presence still lingered in the air, like the memory of a nightmare that refused to let go. The narrow corridor they followed seemed endless. The walls seemed to close in on them with each step, and Caleb could feel the oppressive weight of the space pressing on his chest. The distant echo of footsteps in the corridor felt wrong, as if they weren't their own. The sounds were too faint, too distant, almost as if something or someone else was walking with them in the darkness. I think we should turn back, Sarah urged, pulling at Caleb's sleeve, her voice trembling. No, we can't turn back. Not now. Caleb's voice was hard, though the fear clawed at him just as it did at her. His mind raced with the same question that had been haunting him ever since they stepped inside the church. Why here? Why now? The answer lay ahead, somewhere in the dark. It had to. Suddenly a soft whisper snaked through the air, so faint that it could have been mistaken for the wind, or perhaps their own minds playing tricks. But Caleb felt it deep inside him, as though the whisper was not only in his ears, but in his bones. Do you hear that? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible, laced with dread. He nodded. The voice, it was impossible to understand, the words lost in the shadows. But the tone was unmistakable. It was a call, a beckoning, and it came from further down the corridor. They kept moving, though every step seemed to take them deeper into something far darker than they could have imagined. It was as though they were stepping outside of time, the air growing heavier with each breath. The smell of decay was now undeniable, like something dead and forgotten. And yet, the deeper they moved, the more the faint feeling of eyes watching them became more pronounced. Finally, the corridor opened into a vast chamber, so large that Caleb couldn't make out the far walls, even with the eerie glow from some unseen source illuminating the space. The floor beneath them was uneven, scattered with shards of broken stone and debris, as though the ground itself had been torn apart. But it wasn't the chamber itself that stopped Caleb dead in his tracks. It was what was in the center. A stone altar, cracked and weathered with age, stood at the center of the room, surrounded by faintly glowing symbols carved into the floor. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the lights flickering like dying embers. It was the same kind of glow Caleb had seen in the man's eyes earlier. Only now, it was everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, all of it was covered in these strange markings. An ancient language, a language he could not read, but a language that filled him with an undeniable sense of dread. On the altar lay the object. At first, Caleb thought it was just another relic, another cursed artifact left behind by whatever dark forces had once ruled this place. But as they moved closer, he realized the object was alive, or rather, it was calling to them. It was a large, twisted sculpture made of bone and metal, blackened metal that gleamed like polished obsidian. The shape was unmistakable, though Caleb had never seen anything like it. A figure, or perhaps something that had once been human, twisted in agony. The eyes of the figure were empty sockets, but somehow Caleb felt the weight of their gaze. "Do you feel that?" Sarah asked again, her voice trembling. "Like it's pulling us in." "Yeah," Caleb breathed, his heart racing. "Whatever this thing is, it's the source of all of this. It's the reason those screams keep happening." He stepped closer, drawn by an invisible force, and for a moment he felt as though the room had gone completely silent. The air was thick, almost suffocating, but Caleb couldn't tear his eyes away from the altar. The black figure on the stone seemed to twitch, a faint movement that could have been a trick of the light, or it could have been something more. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't." But it was too late. The moment she touched him, the air seemed to shudder violently, a low rumble filling the room. The ground beneath them trembled, as if the earth itself was waking from a deep slumber. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. Then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, he heard it. The scream. It wasn't the scream of a victim, not this time. It was different. It was an agonized wail, but this time it was something worse, a primal, feral scream that seemed to tear through reality itself. It echoed in their minds, reverberating through the very air around them, filling every corner of the room. "Get away from it," Sarah cried, pulling him back, but Caleb felt himself frozen in place. The scream was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. A living thing, crawling into his mind, clawing at his very thoughts. His vision blurred, and the altar in front of him seemed to shift, the dark figure twitching as if it was coming to life. He could feel it, this ancient force stirring, waking from its slumber. It was angry, and it was aware of them. A voice, his voice, though it sounded distant and wrong, whispered through his mind. "You shouldn't have come here. Now it's too late." The chamber seemed to close in around them, the symbols on the floor glowing brighter, almost blinding, until Caleb could see nothing but the bright, searing light. And then, with a final ear-splitting scream, everything went black. Chapter 10. The Last Cry. Caleb awoke with a gasp, his lungs burning for air as though he had been drowning. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt heavy, unnaturally so. He was lying on the cold, uneven floor of the chamber, his body numb and stiff. The oppressive darkness still hung in the air, but something had changed. The terrible weight of the presence, the thing that had called to him. The room was still, the eerie glow dimmed, as if the very heart of the place had died with the last scream. "Sarah?" His voice cracked as he pushed himself up onto his elbows, searching the room with frantic eyes. She was there, kneeling beside him, her face pale and strained. Her eyes were wide, filled with the same fear that had consumed them both since they first entered this cursed place. Her hand reached out to him, trembling, but there was no time to speak. Caleb could feel it. Something was happening, something they couldn't explain, but it was inevitable. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her voice small and fragile. I don't know," Caleb breathed. His mind spun with disjointed thoughts and memories, but there was one constant: the scream. It still echoed in his mind, louder now than ever before, seeping into every thought, every heartbeat. Sarah helped him to his feet, but the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The walls, once cold and lifeless, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though they were alive, as though they were watching them. The altar in the center of the room was gone. The twisted figure had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an empty stone slab. But it wasn't the altar that caught Caleb's attention now. It was the silence. For a moment, the silence felt like a relief. The scream, the wailing voice that had echoed through the night, had disappeared. There was no longer a presence that reached into their minds, no longer a force that threatened to tear them apart. For the first time since they had arrived, Caleb could hear his own thoughts clearly, without interference. But then, as he looked around, he realized the silence wasn't real. The room wasn't empty. There were eyes. Hundreds, thousands of them. Eyes that seemed to blink and shift, staring at them from the walls, from the shadows, from the very air itself. Eyes that had been watching them all along, waiting for this moment, the moment when the scream would finally end. And then the whisper came. It was a voice, but not a voice. It was a presence, a dark, cold force that filled his mind, that made him feel small, insignificant. "You have released it," the voice whispered, "and now you must pay." Caleb's blood ran cold. He turned to Sarah, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't speak, didn't move. Her lips were trembling, her body frozen in place, as though her soul had left her. "It was never meant to be stopped," the voice continued, its tone cruel, mocking. "You sought to end it, but now you have set it free." Caleb staggered back, trying to make sense of what was happening. The walls, the eyes, the presence, it was all closing in on them. There was no escape, no way out. "You should have listened," the voice whispered. "Now you are part of the cry. Forever." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The walls stopped moving. The eyes vanished. The presence retreated, and Caleb found himself standing alone in the room once more. He looked at Sarah, but her expression was blank, her body limp in his arms. There was no sign of the fear that had gripped her before, no sign of the woman he had fought to protect. It was as if she had become a shell, hollow and empty. Caleb's chest tightened. He shook her gently, but she didn't respond. Her eyes stared ahead, vacant and distant, as though she were no longer truly there. A realization settled over him, cold and final. Sarah was gone. She had been taken, and so had he. The curse of the silent cry had claimed them both. The scream, the presence, the darkness that had consumed the town, Caleb now understood. It was never about the murders, never about the people who had vanished. It had always been about the scream, the cry that had echoed through the night for so long, the cry that had never been meant to end. And now it was their cry. A final scream that would live on forever, lingering in the night, echoing through the walls of the forgotten chamber, never to be silenced. Caleb fell to his knees, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him. He had come here to end it, to stop the nightmare. But in doing so, he had only made it worse. The town would never be free. No one would ever be free. The silent cry would never be silenced. And as the room began to fade away, as the last remnants of the darkness consumed him, Caleb understood that this was his fate now. He would never leave. He would never escape the scream. For the cry was not only a sound, it was a curse. And now it was theirs to carry forever.